All right. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mac Taylor with the Analyst's Office. On Tuesday, my office put out our overview of the governor's budget. This is a document that we put out every year a couple of days after the budget comes out. It's just to give you our initial assessment of the plan and a sort of a mile-high view. It also provides a description of the major changes in the governor's budget. Like you, we have lots of questions about many aspects of the governor's plan, and we'll be spending the next several weeks working with the administration to get more information for you. In some cases, we'll offer you options or alternatives to governor's proposals. In other cases, we'll be making recommendations to you. And those documents will be coming out, as I say, throughout early February and throughout the month. I just want to make a few comments, if I could, Madam Chair. Mm-hmm. Your budget is very much dominated by two issues, Proposition 98 and Proposition 2. And if we can start with talking about the current year, 14-15, it is completely dominated by Proposition 98. As Ms. Bowser noted, they have brought up their revenue estimates in the current year by roughly $2.5 billion, and almost all of it goes to schools. I know for some members and a lot of people out there in the public, they have a hard time understanding how that could be. That is, how come there's no money that's available for other priorities in the budget? And it's basically because of the way we've decided to pay off various school-related obligations when we have a down year in Prop 98. But that is the case. The money goes to schools. That's great for schools. In the current year, because the school year has already started, these increases in the revenues basically are then available for you to spend on one-time purposes. And we think the administration has been very wise in paying off the deferrals, paying off mandates. In the current year, we actually think that you're going to have even more money than what the administration estimates. The current cash flow already exceeds what they're proposing for the year, and depending on what we learn in the next couple of days, high-income taxpayers are making their estimated payments actually by today. So next week we'll have a little better idea about how good year 14-15 cash and revenues will be. And we won't know for sure, or even we won't know for sure in May, but we'll have even more information by then. But what we have said is you likely will have $1 billion or $2 billion more in the current year. Now, what are the implications of that? Well, again, because of our formulas, all of that will go to schools. So there again, you're going to have to explain to many of your advocacy groups and your constituents why is it that you could have funding going up by $4 billion and none of it is available for non-98 purposes. That's the way that we decided to implement the formulas. Now, there are other implications, and some are more important for your overall budget and your non-98 part of the budget. If we have this kind of revenue surge, which we actually talked about back in our November report, you're going to permanently increase your 98 obligations. If it is a temporary surge and your capital gains revenues and your revenues fall down to lower levels in subsequent years, you could actually be worse off in your 98 budget because you would have been committed to higher 98, and yet your revenues won't be able to support those. They'll have to support your 98. You won't have the monies left over, and you might actually have to take a hit to your non-98 portion of the budget. That's also an implication for schools that if we did have a recession, not a recession, even a downturn, you could have made commitments if you provide all of these monies on an ongoing basis in the 15-16 year, you might have to make cutbacks in subsequent years. So what it is really just a caution for you about what you may face on your non-98 part of your budget, and you even need to be careful on your 98 budget. The administration, I think wisely in their 15-16 plan for schools, has some one-time monies built in. And I think that's wise because then if your 98 spending has to go down in subsequent years, you don't have to take as big a hit on your ongoing commitments that school districts would have already made. So we're in this time when a lot's happening with revenues. It's a very good time as far as the level that's coming in. But because of the complicated, complex fiscal structures we have, you do need to be cautious so that we don't end up in situations that are even close to approaching what we faced in 2008, 9, 10, et cetera. As far as the overall governor's approach, we think basically it's a prudent plan. We're able to build up our surpluses somewhat. We pay off a lot of debts. Where the money is in schools, the governor, I think, wisely puts it into the local control funding formula. There are increased costs in some of the health and human services programs. These aren't typically for new commitments. In fact, I think the only major new commitment is related to the governor's proposal to restore a 7% reduction in hours in the in-home supportive services program. But there are cost increases related to Medi-Cal, IHSS, just to maintain your existing programs. So once you do that, there's not a lot of money left over for any sort of new commitments. Let me just comment on 4 particular proposals or issues that are in the governor's budget. The first is on the reserve level. I think the chair and the vice chair's comments sort of provided the bookends for me. At $3.4 billion a year end at the end of the 15-16 years, what the governor's budget proposes, that's the biggest reserve we've had in an awful long time. And that is good news. And the fact is we are building on our reserves. The vice chair's comment, though, about how quickly that can turn around is also appropriate. Our revenue structure is so volatile that in a relatively short time you can lose a lot of money. So if you ask me, well, what would I like to see on a reserve? I'd love to see it even larger. At this point, I think we'll have to wait and see what happens in May. It could be that on the natural, because of Prop 2, that reserve amount will grow. But I think you should really target a comfortable level of reserves given where we are on, if you look at the financial markets, where we are, as Ms. Bossler mentioned, in the length of the recovery. We should be building up our reserves towards that 10% target that the people approved in Proposition 2. And we've made a very good down payment, but I think we have a ways to go there. On the retiree health, we're very pleased to see the administration place emphasis on paying off this debt. I think the vice chair mentioned we do have tens of billions of dollars in unfunded liabilities on our pensions and various things. However, we at least have mechanisms in place to pay those off over time. With your CalSTRS agreement, under CalPERS, we amortize those liabilities. We are addressing all of our big ones with the exception of the retiree health benefits. This is a completely pay-as-you-go system. We owe $72 billion between special funds, federal, state, and we're very pleased that the administration has given lots of visibility to this issue. Unfortunately, the administration doesn't give any money towards this issue. And I think that's okay. Maybe that comes later. This is a complex issue. It's going to take you some time to work through. But you do have Proposition 2 that is out there. This is what it was for. And you have at least 15 years of, in effect, guaranteed roughly $800 million a year, and perhaps even more when we have good capital gains years. And we would just suggest to you this is a great source of paying down those unfunded liabilities towards your retiree health, and it should be viewed as a real prime mechanism if this is one of the liabilities that you want to address. On K-12 schools, again, if you agree with the governor that most of the money should go in the LCFF, paying off the debts, not a lot of issues there. One area where the governor has proposed an important change, and we think we commend them for raising it, is in the area of workforce development. This is a very complex issue where they want to try to bring more coordination to the various regional efforts. But it's a very complex one. You've got 70 consortia that are for adult education. You've got 15 community college consortia. You've got various labor-related, 45 labor-related boards. And bringing these all together and bringing some sort of coherence to them is going to be a tough job. And I think that's an area where you need to start work early. But again, we appreciate the administration raising the issue, and I think there is a lot of room for improvement. And let me just end with a couple of comments about higher education. Clearly, you have a lot of different perspectives on higher education from the Assembly, the Senate, the segments, and the governor. And I think there's been a lot of good discussion about the cost structure for our segments, about how we should fund enrollment. The governor, for example, seems very critical of enrollment-based funding for the universities and yet proposes enrollment-based funding for the community colleges. We don't think it has to be all or nothing. We think that having enrollment targets, for example, is a good thing. It signals what you want to get out of the money that you invest in the systems. It's not a be-all, end-all. You want other outcome measures that help you. So I think there's a lot of discussion on the way that we fund the segments that you're going to want to have. And particularly with regards to tuition, has gotten probably the most light and heat. and a lot of different views on this. I would strongly urge you to think about a longer-term fee policy. The reason why people argue now about who pays and how much tuition should go up or should keep flat is because you frankly have no policy on what you want students and families to pay of their university and how much you want the state to fund. If you could agree on a share of cost policy that families will pay this percentage, the state will pay this percentage, what that does is that it takes away a lot of the discussion that you're now having, and it focuses sharply on the issue of why are costs going up. And again, this is issues that the governor has properly raised and focused on, the speaker through her proposal to a zero-based budgeting. But if you know that whatever costs are going to go up, that families and students are going to have to share proportionally with the state, then your emphasis, all of your focus and attention is on why are costs going up? Do they need to go up? Do we need to look at the cost structures? Do we need to fund research differently or less emphasis on different aspects of what we now pay? So absent a fee policy, every year you're going to have these debates about the universities threatening to raise tuition, you're not wanting them to raise tuition, and I don't think it's particularly helpful over the years. So I would just offer that as a final comment, Madam Chair, and also happy to answer any questions for you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I want to thank both of you for presenting your the budget to us from your from the finance office and then from the LAO, the different perspectives of the budget and recommendations. We're going to open it up for questions and comments. Before we begin, let me just make sure we're clear about a couple of things. From the LAO's perspective, your vision is that we would probably have at least a couple of billion more dollars than what is obviously presented in the governor's budget. In the current year. In the current year. Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask a question with one of the comments made by finance. You listed a number of things in terms of addressing poverty and income inequality. I was trying to figure out how these two factored into our budget. One, the increase in minimum wage and the extended sick leave as budget items in terms of our expenditures, the things that we're investing in.
So obviously both of those are not purely budget at all. They're much larger than that. They do impact our budget. We do have many workers in our IHSS program, in our developmentally disabled services at the regional center level. So the minimum wage and the extension of sick leave benefits to those workers did have an impact on some of our state programs, but that's really a minor piece. Really, I think the mention of those is important in the context that poverty is a very complex problem and one that there needs to be many different tools to address. And so while we have our critical safety net programs like CalWORKS and SSI, SSP, we also have these other efforts as a society that we take to try and also mitigate poverty and the income inequality that's really plagued our nation and our state. So that's just the overall context.
Okay, I was kind of concerned because it gave the impression that those are really budget items, and they didn't appear to be budget items, and probably we can't take credit for it in the budget that these are things we've done to alleviate poverty. They're policy issues that we took and probably affect the private industry more sometimes than us in terms of minimum wage and sick leave. So I didn't want us to think that we had done some great work in the area of poverty by doing those two things. We've done some great stuff in terms of policy, and I think our private sector would probably say they took the greatest bulk in terms of investment in poverty through those particular items. You also list our local control funding formula and concentration grants, and this will be something I guess our committees will deal with. But I know we have some limitations or clearly some requirements that are placed on our university to receive their funding. And I assume that if they increase tuition or increase the number of out-of-state as well as foreign students, that the $125 million that they're scheduled to receive will not be received. Is that correct?
So for the University of California's budget, we have proposed controlling budget language that the $120 million would be available if tuition was held flat, if they kept their out-of-state enrollees at the same level as they were in the current year. So those are the conditions.
Are you aware of any controls that we're placing on our? I guess this $10.8 billion is a concentration grants. Is that for local control funding formula? That's
$10.8 billion is the monies that have gone through the local control funding formula. That's correct.
Okay. Now, oftentimes local control funding formula is somewhat misleading because there's the big thing and then there's the smaller piece that deals with concentration grants. Is this the $10.8 billion for concentration grant or the overall local control funding formula? Because one addresses the issue of poverty in language and foster care, which is a portion of it, but not the whole piece. So I'm trying to figure out exactly how much of this is really for the poverty and income issue in terms of the concentration grant that is a part of the local control funding formula.
The $10.8 billion is the entire allocation that's going through the local control funding formula. The amount that's attributed to the concentration grant and the is as a subset of that.
Do we know the amount?
No, because of the way the local control funding formula is being implemented for every district, the amount's going to be a little bit different. We've addressed this through the spending requirement regulations by looking at what districts are currently doing for low-income students and English learners relative to the rest of the population, and as we increase their funding formula, we require them to do proportionally more for those students.
So we have no numbers concerning the concentration grants for last year or the coming year? Not
right now, because it's not. It's the way the funding's allocated. It's allocated relative to what your funding. It's allocated relative to what your funding level is now and what your funding level should be. So for every district, that allocation is going to be different based on where they're starting and where we want them to end up.
Do you know the approximate percentage of the funding will be for concentration grants?
Ultimately, for supplemental and concentration grants, approximately 20% of the money will go for that. That's when we get to full funding, though. So, as I said, some districts were getting more money than others. And ultimately, when the funding formula is fully funded, districts will be funded more equitably based on the students they serve. So those districts that are serving more of those students will receive more money based on the formula. But that's not how the funding's. That's not where we started. So, So it's difficult to say until we're fully implemented, what portion of that money is going for those specific parts of the formula.
Now, it's somewhere in your presentation you made a comment that we would basically this year be at full funding for local control. Is that right? That based on the money that we're allocating that's coming in, that we would be at full funding for local control? Is that correct?
No, we're not at full implementation. The $4 billion does allow us to get there ahead of the schedule that we thought we were going to be on last year. So the full implementation, I'm going to have to turn to Nick Schweitzer for that.
Sure, I believe we're able to close another 30% of the remaining gap based on the new revenues. I think we had only expected to be able to close roughly 10 to 20% of the gap based on our projections. So we're due to the new revenues, we're able to get closer to full funding more quickly than what we had originally anticipated.
Okay, I'm not going to take all the time. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things that you'd made regarding that, and if I have other questions, I'll have them near the end. At this time, we're going to Ms. Melendez. Did you have any questions? Not at this time. Not at this time. Mr. Mullen? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for your leadership thus far. Thank you both for the presentation. As one of the speaker's appointees to the California Workforce Investment Board, I want to thank you for the dollars appropriated, or at least proposed, rather, for workforce development coordination. I have two questions. First one on the long-term fiscal picture. Second one specific to redevelopment and policy going forward. So first one, I appreciate the governor focusing on debt repayment, acknowledging the long-term liabilities of state employee retiree health. Looking forward to some of the details on how that cost curve gets bent so dramatically there on that graph. Appreciate the full embrace of the rainy day fund to capture the revenue spikes, capital gains, which you both referenced. But my continued concern is the long-term health of the budget with the expiration of Proposition 30. The governor indicating that that was a temporary one-time deal. Somehow we're going to need to backfill that revenue. And the concern is the underlying volatility that Prop 2 Rainy Day Fund helps with, but it doesn't necessarily fix in terms of the volatility that both of you have talked about. And I know we're going to be hearing proposals on structural tax reform, but has the governor given any indication of acknowledging that underlying volatility and a willingness to embrace something that looks at structural tax reform to so we can better ride out that next downturn, which could, as Max suggests, result in severe deficits potentially?
So the implementation of the approval of Proposition 2 by the voters was a really important first step to reducing the volatility. That's why we took the many different proposals and really looked at and zeroed in on capital gains, because capital gains is the single largest and most volatile revenue component that we have in our state's revenue system. And also the recovery this time around with a lot of the gains going to the highest income. This is an issue that has plagued California over the last decade or two, and will probably continue to plague California to some extent. But Proposition 2, I think, with really shaving off those spikes of capital gains and putting them aside in the rainy day fund, is a really important first step to mitigating the uncertainty of the boom and bust cycles that we lived through this past decade. In terms of tax reform, this is something that our office continues is always looking at ways to improve the current tax structure, but we don't have any specific proposals at this time. But it is something we continue to look at. We know there's a lot of proposals that are being made in the legislature and outside groups, and so we do continue to really drill down and look at those. But we don't have a specific proposal related to tax reform at this time.
Okay, Madam Chair, just my second question on redevelopment. First, I want to applaud the administration for changing the ROPS, or proposing that we change the ROPS process to an annual as opposed to a 6-month. I had that in a piece of legislation. Good to see that that's been picked up in the budget. A question about the dissolution of redevelopment and the original intent of redevelopment as related to dealing with urban poverty and blight. Madam Chair talks about poverty. I think the phrase was unfunded poverty liability, I think Madam Chair said. So there were obviously mixed results with redevelopment in terms of dealing with, or as a strategy for dealing with urban poverty. But it seems like there's a laser focus on dissolution, harvesting assets, moving money around. But I'm trying to get a sense of what the underlying sort of policy rationale for that is, and what the replacement is really for redevelopment going forward when you're talking about dealing with urban poverty, blight, affordable housing development in high-cost areas and poor areas of the state. And I am talking about a strategy to deal with poor, working poor. It seems to me that there's not necessarily a policy discussion as related to the dissolution of redevelopment. Can you address that at all?
Well, the dissolution of redevelopment is something that has been fundamental to our recovery of our state budget. And that's because billions of dollars have been returned to schools, but also to core county services and core city services as well. So it was a really important financial piece of our ability to move out of our recessionary time. In terms of going forward and some of the important things and tools, as you mentioned, that redevelopment was able to offer, last summer a new infrastructure financing district was passed and signed by the governor, and we see this as a tool that can be very powerful in bringing together the different local governments to address common and difficult problems of blight and in infrastructure, especially in urban areas. Also, in terms of affordable housing, a significant allocation of the cap and trade monies was allocated, 20% allocated to the Sustainable Communities pot of money, and this money is really envisioned on building transit-oriented development and low-income housing associated with those types of infrastructure, types of developments. So that's also an important component of our effort to really replace and mitigate some of the impacts of the redevelopment dissolution.
Mr. McCarty, yes. Your question?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Question on for finance on early education and higher ed, but first just a general comment. I know there's a lot of angst that not enough was done in this budget to reinvest in critical programs in California, but you know that education in Prop 98 was certainly not necessarily taken care of, but critical, focusing on getting back to where we were, and nothing was hit more in the Great Recession than education funding, and there really is no greater effort to focus on the middle class and poverty than focusing on education from P all the way through 16. And so I know the big focus, as LAO said, is Prop 98, but I wanted to talk a bit about the other ends of it, early education and higher ed. So first of all, in early education, I see that part of the budget is to include funding for the 4,000 slots that were part of last year's budget deal. But my understanding, there was not necessarily a commitment, but language in there to focus on all of low-income 4-year-olds in California. And so is there a desire from the administration to expand more than those 4,000 slots funded in the budget?
So yes, the budget does fully implement the provisions of last year's budget, which included the additional expansion of an additional 4,000 slots for early childhood education. I think I don't remember the other component, but yeah, go ahead.
Sure. There was also a increase to the reimbursement rates. There was also one-time money for quality expansions, and along with the preschool slots, there was significant investment in wraparound care. So because the state preschool is a part-day program, we now provide funding, which is on the non-98 cost for the rest of the day, the additional hours needed for those families to access the preschool, to provide them the child care as well. So I think at this point in time, as Ms. Bosler noted, we're fully funding the preschool expansion, the wraparound, fully funding the increase in reimbursements rates, and we're sort of evaluating where that's gotten us, how that's working out, how the one-time money for quality is working out, and then the agreement last year did include a commitment to eventually provide preschool for all low-income children. So we'll look at further expansions in the future.
So do you anticipate that would be part of the early enough to be in the May revise, or are you looking at the out years for that?
We don't have any further proposals in this budget. I think that we're looking at these monies are new, these slots are new. We are doing our best. The Department of Education is really looking at where the gaps are currently, because in some areas of the state there are fewer, there's less of a gap on all the four-year-olds being covered. And so they're allocating those resources out to best fill those gaps and provide as most universal coverage as possible for all low-income four-year-olds. I think as we continue to evaluate that, and as that gets implemented, we'll have a better sense of where the gaps are. So it's a continued work in progress.
Okay. Just last bit on that. My understanding is that those 4,000 slots were freed up this past summer, and there was, I think, from CDE's estimates, over 25, 30,000 inquiries to fill those 4 slots, so we know that there's the demand out there. Lastly, on the higher ed piece, I know it's a priority for all of us, and certainly the administration, I would certainly like to hope that we could do more to expand access to higher ed in California. I just wanted to focus on, a big, obviously, attention has been on the University of California and the tuition issue. So I guess the question, as far as going back and forth on the fee hikes, is that certainly in this budget, you mentioned that there was kind of a 4-year plan to give 5% and 5% to the system plus 4% and 4%. This is the 3rd year, and you have that 4%, which is roughly $120 million. So if the University UC Regents did go ahead and go forward with their fee increase, which is significant, is the administration prepared to pull back that $120 million that's currently on the table for the UC system?
So the way the budget is currently written is that it is budgetary controlling language. So if the fees are increased in the budget year, then the $120 million would not be available for the university. So that's how it's currently written. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chavez.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. A couple of comments, a couple of questions or statements. I'm very happy to see career tech education go forward and adult education. As you know, that was a big push we had to do last session. So I'm very supportive to see we're doing that, because as we know, that's the best way to take advantage of jobs and all throughout the state. But as you mentioned, it is complex because the community colleges in my district have a different job requirement than maybe a community college in Fresno. And I think at the local level is the best way to provide it. So I think our grant program and how we're assigning it is totally appropriate. And also with adult education, as the consortiums go forward, I've been attending them in my district, and what I found out is that a portion of my district is doing it through the community colleges, and the other portion is doing it through the high school system. And it's really interesting to attend those to see the dialogue there. And one's very smooth and one is not so smooth. A request. A lot of people think that the war's over, but as we sit here today, 9,800 women and men are in Afghanistan. And when you look at the numbers, basically 10% of the military is coming out of California. So that means roughly 1,000 California residents are in Afghanistan. And when they come back from there, though we may not think that they're in a battle or a war, that's not reality at all. They are. And when I see that the county veteran service officers were cut $3 million. Now we're talking a budget of $165 billion across the state, but we can't spend $3 million, which is dust, to take care of those veterans who are coming back. And furthermore, we know from studies we've had before, the real requirement for the county veteran service officers is an additional $16 million, not $3 million. And that for every dollar that we pay for a county veteran service officer, we get a return of something $10 to $15 per $1, because those veterans are able to receive services to go to college and to get a job and be part of the American dream. So if they're willing to fight for the American dream, I think we ought to be able to reinstate. I would say 3 million was nice. I would probably go a higher number of 6. So I would just like to state that to the Budget Committee here. We still have veterans out there. Do you think there's any movement within the governor's budget to help our veterans?
The issue of the returning veterans is certainly an issue of our time, a big issue of our time, and addressing their needs is something that the state has worked diligently to do by improving our state's Veterans Affairs services that we provide the returning veterans to really help them link up with their federal benefits in a much more timely way. Also, we have activated 3 new veterans homes in recent years to serve veterans as well, and those are have increased funding in the area of veterans significantly over the last several years. The money related to the CVSOs was part of a one-time augmentation that was made last year. I think the overall issues with there's many important things that we need to fund in the state, but that balance between one-time and ongoing is a continued concern for us, that we remain in balance over the next several years, and so that was the underpinning of the decision to not include it again this year, just in terms of making sure we could have a sustainable for the long term. So,
and I'd just like to state, I understand one time, but as we know historically, looking at World War II, looking at Korea, looking at Vietnam, and look what we're seeing now, the young person who goes today is somebody that we're going to deal with in the next 20 or 30 years. So we need to have a larger look at that. So I hope this committee would look at taking care of our veterans as far as the county veteran service officers. And my last issue is, I'm happy to see that the general fund has $940 million for early childhood education. But if you think about it, in the general fund, we're spending $67 billion for education out of the general fund. The way we framed this discussion, we call it child care. We need to, for everybody, forget the term child care. We're not talking about babysitting. We're talking about early cognitive development of children. And because of the challenges we're having economically in our society, many families that are just barely paying their rent are warehousing children in centers where they are not developing cognitively. And so children are going to school, and some kids, like my grandchildren, are going in and they can read and write because I'm able to make sure they have that ability. But it's an economic issue. If young children's parents, because of their economic situation, cannot have that quality cognitive development 1 to 5, then those children go to school not prepared. So I'd ask us to, when you're in committees, don't let them use the word child care or caretakers, but early childhood education and professionals who understand cognitive development of young children early on. And I would like to see the $940 million go up, and I applaud my, member from Sacramento, because it's one of his issues, and I agree with you, the number is much more than 4,000, and I'd like to work across the aisle to ensure that we take care of our children that need that. Thank you.